Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are revisiting a couple that we actually have visited within recent memory, but only in short story form. We're doing N or M, and it has our dear Beresfords.
Tommy and Tuppence. We are back with the Beresfords. I'm excited. Catherine, I think you were excited about this one as well. We shall discuss whether or not our excitement was justified. Yes and no is my short answer for the top of this episode. And I suppose we should talk about the publication history of this one. NRM. We are in World War II and how this was first published in the U.S. in 1941 for Dodd Mead, of course, and then later in November of the same year in the U.K. by, of course, the Collins Crime Club. And then, as always with Christie, because she was so prolific, it's just interesting to know that even though this was published in 1941, it was written in 1940, so very much written during the war and in the early years of the war. Christie had a lot of problems actually with the reception of this book in the U.S. In 1940, the U.S. had not yet entered the war, and the initial response from U.S. publishers was, ooh, this is a little too much pro-war stuff. Like, I don't know if our readers are going to like this, because there had been a lot of anti-war sentiment in the 1940 election, where Roosevelt was, of course, reelected, and there was just a lot of that talk going on. So for a while, no one even seemed to want it, which was crazy. This is for serialization, of course. Dodd Mead would always publish the novels, but we're talking about serialization, which is where she often made all of her money. So she was very upset about that. It's worth remembering that there were still 5 more years of war to go after this book was written.
Well, and ironically, at some point very early on, one of the blowhards at the hotel that they're staying at says, well, this war is going to go on for another 6 years.
I know. It's one of those instances where I just think it's interesting to think about what a different reading experience N or M when it was published must have been. And I think it's just really hard for us to imagine what it was like reading it then. And we had a similar effect with Murder on the Orient Express, where all of that Lindbergh business that she was very clearly referencing, the incident had happened, but the adjudication of it was all still going on. So that was not a closed case when she was writing about it. So that too was a very different experience. We should note there was an alternate working title that we get from her notebooks, which was Second Innings. And that's sort of a reference to a second chance for our detective duo from days of yore when they were bright young things in the 20s. NRM itself is a reference to a Latin phrase taken from a catechism in the Book of Common Prayer. The answer to the question, what is your Christian name, is answer NRM, and then that NRM stands for nomen vel nomina, which means name or names. The other thing that I think is just interesting is that Christie wrote this book simultaneously with The Body in the Library. And she actually did that because that was her way of coping with the war. And she writes about that in her autobiography, You Know I Will Never Pass Up a Chance.
We always enjoy it.
A little ramble in the Christie autobiography.
Yes, of course.
And she writes that she never found any difficulty in writing during the war, as some people did. I suppose because I cut myself off into a different compartment of my mind. I could live in the book amongst the people I was writing about and mutter their conversations and see them striding about the room I had invented for them. She even goes on to talk about how while she was writing in London, she would sit with her face covered with a pillow as a protection against flying glass. I love this idea of her in London mid-Blitz, not really knowing if she's going to get bombed out any moment, just sitting down writing one page of NRM and then another page of Miss Marple and The Body in the Library. That seems about right for Dame Agatha.
Yes, it does. We all have our coping mechanisms, but many of them are not nearly that productive.
This is true. All right, well, let's move on to the meat of our story and talk about our victim, Catherine Brobeck.
Well, our victim is England. England and the Allies, because you see there's a fifth column operating within England in the service of the Nazis, and they could destroy, of course, the entire Allied war effort through espionage and saboteurs. We do not have one person at risk here. We have the Allied war effort.
Do we have a Christie thriller? We haven't had one of those in quite a while. while, but
quite some time.
Methinks this sounds like a Christie thriller in which there may be some shadowy mastermind supervillains who need to be unmasked, a la Mr. Brown from The Secret Adversary. Perhaps they could even be the titular N or M.
Perhaps they could be. That seems very much the direction in which we are headed.
All right, well, let's talk about our suspects because, as usual, it is everyone. This is very much a closed circle, if not puzzle mystery, at least adventure story with a healthy dose of mystery, because the bulk of the story takes place in a coastal boarding house called Sans Souci, and there are quite a few people there. So starting off that list, we have the woman who runs the boarding house, Mrs. Perena, who claims to be Spanish, but who just may be Irish.
And we are pretty immediately told that she might be Irish because our next suspect is Mrs. O'Rourke, who obviously is Irish.
And how? She is very Irish.
Yes, and she's also very watchful and suspicious. And she says, well, I would know my countrywoman anywhere.
Right.
So we're immediately set up to think that Mrs. Perena is not who she says she is.
Next up, we've got Sheila Perena, who is Mrs. Perena's beautiful young daughter who has a pouty, tempestuous side. She reminded me of Salome Otterborn's daughter from Death on the Nile. We've come across this character before.
Right.
The sort of sulky daughter who has her own charms and who we're ultimately supposed to like, but we're never given much of a reason to.
No, especially because Sheila Perena's romantic interest here is Karl von Dine, who is a German refugee, but he's not Jewish. But his family was nevertheless put into concentration camps because of, I guess, political disagreement. And he now works in chemical experimentation in England. So he seems, or is meant to seem, very shady to begin with, and he has a flirtation, it seems, with Sheila.
Next up, we've got Commander Haydock, who is presented as just a Navy man through and through. And speaking of military men through and through, our next suspect is Major Bletchley. No relation to that Bletchley, i.e. Bletchley Park, which was, of course, the major center of code breaking in World War II. Although apparently that connection was suspicious enough to get our dear Dame Agatha looked into a bit by MI5, which is one of the more interesting side notes, I think, to come out of this novel. And I was looking into this a little bit. The main reason why is one of the major code breakers at Bletchley Park. It's not just that she named a character Bletchley and MI5 was like, hey, wait a second, that seems too coincidental.
Right.
Agatha Christie herself was really good friends with this major codebreaker named Dilly Knox. MI5 did not interview Christie directly because that, of course, would have raised some eyebrows among the public and immediately, made it very difficult to keep the whole Bletchley Park business under wraps. So what they did is that they questioned Dilly Knox, and you can imagine they said, did you tell your friend Agatha Christie, the famous novelist, what we're doing at Bletchley Park? And Knox then had to casually have tea with Agatha Christie and fish for the information as to how Christie had named Major Bletchley. And I just love that because that to me sounds like a scene from a Tommy and Tuppence novel.
Right. No, it does.
Right? Yeah, let's just have tea. Hey, Agatha, so how did you come up with that name Bletchley for your book? And apparently this is what she says. She said, Bletchley, my dear, I was stuck there on my way by train from Oxford to London and took revenge by giving the name to one of my least lovable characters. She was not a super spy. It was all a coincidence.
Although, you know what? If she were a super spy, would we ever know?
That's true. Spoken like a super spy, Dame Agatha. But I like the idea that we also get her opinion as to Major Bletchley through that anecdote. Right. So not one of her favorites. I mean, he is, again, the Anglo-Indian colonel, the Boer, who no one really wants to speak to. At least in this novel, the cardboard appearance of this character is used to good effect because Tommy and Tuppence are constantly questioning whether or not Major Bletchley is just a facade because he seems like such a facade. Right. So there's at least that.
And he's actually, in all honesty, not more dislikable than our next suspects, Kaylee and Mrs. Kaylee. Kaylee is like a creepster. in all honesty. He just sits like an invalid, like wrapped in rugs. And then when he does speak, he's like a blowhard with very bizarre opinions.
Well, he's a little bit of a Hitler, of a Nazi sympathizer.
Well, I mean, it's not exactly that he's a Nazi sympathizer so much as he just really respects, shall we say, German mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife is the biggest mouse of all time. She can't even finish a sentence.
They are a problematic couple. I think that would be putting it mildly. He reminded me of Mr. Woodhouse from Emma, but with none of the charm. A fussy old invalid who can't stop thinking about his ill health.
Right.
Then next up, we have Mrs. Sprott, who is a young mother at Sans Souci, and she is there with her darling toddler, Betty, who is 2 years old.
They've essentially gone there because they were in London and they're trying to avoid the Blitz. Then we also have, we'll just call her creepy Polish lady who lurks in the bushes outside of the boarding house.
Yeah, she alternately lurks in the bushes or has these intense tete-a-tetes with Carl von Deinem.
Right.
So she's beautiful. It is noted that she's beautiful many times, but she is mysterious and sort of creepy, and we don't know what's going on with her. But we sure will by the end of this story.
Yes, we will.
On that note, let's talk about the world as it appears to be. And since we are more or less in a Christie thriller for the first time in a while, probably since Why Didn't They Ask Evans, although Murder is Easy also has some thrillerish elements to it. In doing a summary of this plot, we're going to be a little fast and loose here with the details since it's all a little silly, and I think Christie would be the first to admit that. She wrote often about, what a lark it was to write these thrillers because it was so much easier and simpler and linear than what she was doing in the puzzle mysteries.
It's also because they're hard to talk to, like especially in our structure, because they're overpacked with detail. Mm-hmm. It's so much detail that if you actually were to explain what the plot is, you might as well just read it.
Yeah, so we're going to do a summary that suffices to have an intelligent, or so we hope, conversation about the story and how we would rank it afterward. But that is the most that we can and should do, I think, in this forum.
Agreed.
All right, take it away, Catherine.
So we meet up with Tommy and Tuppence at home in London.
They're grumpy that no one seems to want them in the war effort.
It's unclear if they actually have any jobs.
It seems like maybe Tommy had some sort of a ho-hum job and Tuppence was more of a homemaker, but that's all implied, never stated.
Right.
So who knows?
So we don't quite know, but we do know that their twin children, Derek and Deborah, are off working for, respectively, the RAF, and Deborah's working in intelligence.
I'd just like to interject, wonderful for them. I'm so happy that the pregnancy Tuppence referenced at the end of Partners in Crime turned out to be the gift of twins. So they got two for the price of one.
Boy and a girl who seem, quite intelligent.
Although anyone who's delivered twins, they would probably say it's two for the price of two. But this is also another instance where the Christie chronology gets a little wonky because the story in which that Partners in Crime reference is made about Tuppence being pregnant was published in 1924. Partners in Crime, the collection, was published in 1929. So if we go from there, this book being in 1940, that makes no sense. They would have to be 11, but they would be 16 at most in 1940. So again, this is all, I guess who's to say that the story Christie published in 1924 wasn't referencing a slightly earlier time so that they are around 20 years old.
Right.
Now,
I mean, that's sort of where I was going, is they seem like maybe they're 20.
They're certainly older than they should be by the chronology. And then they seem to be rather advanced in their careers for how young they have to be.
Right.
It's all a little fudged.
It is.
But that's fine. We're in Tommy and Tuppence world. Just let go and have a fun time.
Right. And
if you can.
So Tommy and Tuppence are now in their 40s and are twiddling their thumbs, Shea Beresford, which also kind of really disappointingly is apparently now a very modest flat. I mean, I don't know why I was disappointed by that, but I kind of was.
Why did you think that they were going to be such successes after their foray into the detective business and Partners in Crime? Honestly, I think we're lucky that they have shelter.
Yeah, that they didn't end up on the streets. Yeah, I mean, their skill quality running their detective agency was iffy.
So they are very quickly, after we catch up with them again, paid a visit by a Mr. Grant, who wants to offer Tommy a boring paper-pushing government job in Scotland. Tuppence finds an excuse that any reader of The Secret Adversary and Partners in Crime should see through immediately.
Right.
She has this neighbor who's like, oh, she broke her leg. I have to go help her. It's an emergency. So we know that Tuppence is pretending to leave and totally listening in on the conversation that Tommy is about to have with this Mr. Grant.
This is a spycraft involved here. She slams the outside door while very carefully opening like a cupboard door to hide him.
Well, I believe that the slamming of a door was the clue / misdirection that the Man in the Mist hinged upon in the Partners in Crime collection.
Yes,
so
it is.
There we go. Again, we're in Tommy and Tuppence world here.
Right. And so she's just chilling there, eavesdropping, which any reader should know, but guess who doesn't know that?
Could it be Tommy?
Might be Tommy.
Yeah. Tommy is offered a secret mission recommended by their old friend, Mr. Carter, who we learn, and I believe this is the first time we learn who the real man is behind the Mr. Carter alias. He is the now retired Lord Easthampton.
Right.
Oh,
yeah.
My gosh. A member of the nobility. So what's going to happen is that Tommy is not going to Scotland. He's going to Leahampton, which is a kind of Bournemouth sort of seaside resortish town. And there he is going to root out 2 German super spies who have been nicknamed N or M. And what Christie thriller story doesn't include someone dying and having a secret code or enigmatic phrase uttered on their dying lips before they take their last breath? So here we have a dying spy who referenced N or M and Song Susie.
Well, Song Susie.
Yeah, at first they thought it was Song Susie, but they figured out that he must have meant this boarding house in Leahampton, and that N or M are either there or people associated with them are there, or somehow Sans Souci is the means to figuring out who N or M are.
It's kind of cruelly mentioned that the dying man did not have very good French.
Yeah, his final phrase was poorly pronounced French. So Tuppence, of course, has heard all this, and she also, of course, manages to get to Sans Souci in advance of Tommy. And that's kind of a great scene where Tommy gets there and is immediately confronted with Mrs. Blankensop, which reminded me of Miss Blankenship from Mad Men.
I know,
personally.
yes. I did think that too.
Nice to see you, Miss Blankenship.
I look forward to hearing that every day.
But also it's really funny because she's decided that her nom de guerre is Patricia Blankensop because all of her undergarments are embroidered with PB.
Right, Prudence Beresford.
Correct.
Yeah. Tommy's going by the name of Mr. Meadows.
Tuppence is kind of mad that he didn't pick something, more clever. And his response was basically, well, I didn't embroider all of my undergarments.
He's like, well, I don't have my initials in my underwear, so I didn't really have a lot of strategy to go on here.
Yeah, so Tommy basically immediately has to reveal to Mr. Grant that Tuppence is there. Mr. Grant decides, well, obviously they're going to have to loop her in. And actually, well, isn't it good on her anyway? And I got fooled by that slamming door. So Tommy and Tuppence decide that they're independently yet together going to investigate by essentially taking up the weird relationships you'd have with anybody in a boarding house, especially in a boarding house in a Christie story. And so we've already described all of them above, but as we already said, the suspicion very early on falls on Mrs. Perenna and her daughter Sheila, and of course the German refugee Carl.
We should just clarify that Carter has also told Tommy and Tuppence that N is a man and M is a woman. So they know that they're looking for a man and a woman here in Sans Souci. And pretty early on, they decide that M, the woman, must be Mrs. Perenna because they're just so suspicious of her. And she just generally seems like a very suspicious sort of a person. She's very guarded, and there's actually a couple of great sequences with Tuppence. One where she's on a staircase and Mrs. O'Rourke is at the top and Mrs. Perenna is at the bottom, and she feels very intimidated and almost in physical danger by the two of them, as if they're animals on the attack.
Right. There's also a pretty good scene later where Tuppence decides to dig through Mrs. Perenna's room.
Yeah.
And
it's actually probably one of the better sequences in the novel.
It's actually, it's actually the best few pages in the novel because Tuppence says to Tommy that she's going to do it instead because it would be less suspicious if she's digging around for aspirin. And so she is digging through everything. And Mrs. Perenna comes in. Tuppence plays the fool, like a ditz.
But we can see Mrs. Perenna seeing through that.
Yeah, she can see through it. And she says, well, my dear, I know you have aspirin. And so when Tuppence goes back into her room, Tuppence opens her own drawer and realizes that, yeah, she has a bottle of aspirin, but it's at the very back of a dresser drawer, which means that Mrs. Perenna has been digging through her room.
It's a great cat and mouse sequence, and it is by far the most suspenseful sequence in the book. And I am both using that to praise that sequence itself, but I will be using that to criticize some future sequences that just are meant to be suspenseful and simply are not.
No.
But in any case, so there's a lot of focus on Mrs. Perenna, and we do learn from their informant, Mr. Grant, who they check in with periodically, that Mrs. Perenna is a former IRA sympathizer, and her husband was very much involved with the IRA, so there is a great deal of animosity that they have toward Britain. So that's very much a possibility, and it occupies a lot of the middle section of this book.
Right. Meanwhile, Tuppence, who we find out, I guess, is really good with children, befriends the toddler Betty, whose mother always seems to be losing her. And Betty speaks in very garbled English, which Christie spends, I will have to be honest here, a really unfortunate amount of time writing out.
I will actually disagree with you on this one. And I know I'm going out on a limb because it reminded me of the doggy speak in Dumb Witness and a little bit of the POV Linda passages from Evil Under the Sun, both of which we have pointed out recently in a critical way. It did remind me of that a little bit, but I actually enjoyed it. I secretly think that the best character in this book is Betty Sprott.
Sure.
I really do. I think Betty Sprott is charming and believable, and the sequences in which she says nonsense are amusing and touching, especially given where the whole Betty Sprott
is. And I will also make this note. She's obsessed with this handful of nursery books, particularly Goosey Goosey Gander. But there are some other ones. She sort of just points to the books she doesn't like. She doesn't like the ragged older ones. She likes the newer ones. Tuppence just spends a lot of time reading to this child in this book. And as this is happening, the mystery European woman just keeps turning up spying at Sanssouci.
So eventually, little Betty Sprott is kidnapped. There's this scene where everyone is outside and all of a sudden they realized, wait a second, where's Betty? And it looks like once again, Mrs. Sprott has lost her child. It is pretty horrifying. And you're like, oh God, is this child going to be okay? But for a kidnapping, there certainly are a lot of witnesses to this kidnapping.
So many witnesses. It's like everywhere they walk in town, people are like, oh I
saw Betty. yeah, I saw her. She was with that Polish woman. So they know that it's this weird Polish woman who's taken her, and they're able to track her through this frantic hunt where Mrs. Sprott begs them not to call the police because she goes inside the house and we learn that she was actually going to get Major Bletchley's gun because she just goes all commando on this thing and seems to be out to protect her child at all costs. And she says that she found this note up there which said, if you go to the police, we'll harm Betty. So she won't let them go to the police.
And all the men fight her on it. And all the women
fight her on it, and all the women back her up on it and say, I would do the same thing. They team up with Commander Haydock, who has a car, and they chase this woman with Betty over the countryside till they actually catch up with them, and they're walking along this green. They are conveniently near a cliffside at this point. The woman is clutching Betty and doesn't speak English, so she's yelling something very fiercely. She's very angry and emotional, and she seems to be about to jump off the cliff with Betty in her arms. None of the men is willing to make a shot for fear of hitting Betty, but it is Mrs. Strop who pulls out that handgun that she retrieved from the house and who makes a remarkable shot, killing this Eastern European woman so that she collapses. And I guess they weren't that close close enough to the side that would imperil Betty even further. And then she dies and Betty runs to Mrs. Sprott, and she has seemingly done the impossible and saved her little girl.
Right. We find out that the woman, so her name is Wanda Polonska, and there's nothing that suspicious about her other than that this woman who seems a little peasanty seemed to have had enough money to make it to England and like be fending for herself at the outbreak of the war. But there's no obvious link to her being involved with the Nazis or any fifth column in England.
It's mysterious as to why she wanted to kidnap the child, but they're all sort of like, well, I guess she was just crazy. And then we get this sequence where Tommy goes out for a walk and drinks with Commander Haydock, and I'm not kidding. We've identified what is the best sequence within the novel. Here, by far, has got to be the worst. Tommy slips in the bathroom at Commander Haydock's house, thereby opening up a secret chamber that proves beyond any doubt that Commander Haydock is, in fact, N. We really are just told that. And it really does happen that coincidentally. It's encryption equipment that proves beyond a doubt that Commander Haydock is a German spy. It can see, how did I not see it before? Of course, he's a Prussian general. And
because of the
Tommy
shape
thinks, though,
of
that
his head.
Oh, we'll get there. That's going to be one of my stuck in his time arguments. And we've come across this before at Christie's obsession with the shape of Germans' heads. I just don't even understand what she's talking about. But in any case, he thinks that he pulled one over on Commander Haydock and just played dumb, much as Tuppence tried to play dumb with Mrs. Perenna and failed. He's able to leave Commander Haydock's place and he goes back to Sanssouci, only to be, of course, bashed over the head and knocked unconscious because, again, that always has to happen to Tommy in a Tommy and Tuppence story.
Now we would say that he had probably a CTE.
The brain injury that football players
from concussion.
Yeah.
It's amazing that Tommy and Tuppence are the only Christie characters that ever aged, because with Tommy's history of head injuries, you would really not think that he would.
And then he disappears for many, many pages, just as he did in The Secret Adversary, and Tommy and Tuppence are separated and doing their own thing. And we will get to that in The World As It Actually Is, but that's where we are. I mean, by the end of The World As It Appears to Be, we are really just told who N is.
Right.
And we know that it's Commander Haydock. And the true mystery is, well, who is M? Who is this woman?
Yeah, and so to go right there, The World As It Actually Is, there are really two clues. Clue number one of an English child who is constantly being read to, also doesn't look at all like her mother or appear to speak much English. Perhaps we can make a reasonable leap that something is off. And the deduction here might be that Betty Strop is not Betty Strop, which means who is Mrs. Strop and who is Wanda Polonska?
I think there was a little bit of a missed opportunity because I think Betty's gibberish, someone could have said something like, wow, it almost sounds like she's speaking another language, or something that would be a little bit of a fairer clue here. Right. I think you're being a little kind to Christie calling this a clue within this novel. I feel almost like it's meant to be. I just am not sure that the execution is right, but that you're right. Maybe I could be giving her too much credit. I say this is where a little bit of my specialized knowledge is going to come in. We don't reference our personal lives too much on this podcast, but as the father of a 2-year-old, I do know that there is such a wide range of lingual ability at this age. There are plenty of kids that don't even speak yet, like a word. Right. And gibberish from a 2-year-old is by no means suspicious in terms of, is this child actually speaking real English? Clue number 2 is Mrs. Strop is really not a good mother. Right. It's funny because as I was reading this book, again, maybe because I have a little bit of the everyday experience, I first thought to myself, well, this is interesting because parents these days are so helicoptery. And of course, this book was written in 1940. And this is when there was a totally different philosophy as to how you raise your children. And you just let them go off on their own. And I think that's true. But there's that scene in which Tuppence is thinking in her bed and Betty just wanders into her bedroom. Mm-hmm. And she's like, oh, hey, Betty. And Betty just like plays on the floor.
Takes all the shoelaces out of her shoes.
With the shoelaces, which do end up being a sort of spy adjacent thing, although we can't really make a clue out of that either because it just doesn't make any sense and we have to be told what that means later on. But Mrs. Sprott definitely seems to have a hard time keeping track of her daughter. And even though there's a lot of surface affection paid when other people are watching, I think we would be rewarded for wondering if those maternal bonds bonds are truly as strong as they are. And especially if we take a closer look at that sequence of events on the cliffside. And that is something that Tuppence keeps on thinking about over and over again. So Christie does really play fair with that. She keeps on mentioning Solomon, and we'll eventually get to what she means by that. But I think the only true clue for me has to do with the Mrs. Sprott business, specifically when she's
the gunshot,
quote unquote, saving her daughter on the cliffside. And I mean, I guess we can just get to it right now if we're going to consider it a clue. Sure, it seems as if she's saving her daughter, but would a true mother actually risk shooting her daughter? Like, there was a really good chance that she was going to shoot Betty, which is why none of the men, many of whom were experienced with firearms, were going to do it. She's claiming not to be experienced at all. And then she pulls off this amazing shot. Well, isn't it a much simpler explanation for this that she actually doesn't care that much about Betty, and she is a good shot, which is why she was able to kill Wanda Polonska as well as she did with that headshot.
Well, and also then the obvious corollary to that is, who is the person who is actually keeping tabs on Betty Strop the entire book? I mean, other than Tuppence. Well, gee, maybe it's the weird Polish lady. And what do we think that might mean? Maybe it doesn't mean something nefarious with regards to her.
Right. And that's, I think, the one aspect of this novel that has the Christie-ish pull the mask off of what's actually happening here, turning the tables of what appears to be happening is totally different from what's actually happening.
Right.
That's the one part of the novel that I think does feel like it comes out of a better Christie novel, or even a
Christie. And there are hints of how it could have been done better. Tuppence makes up this whole backstory about how she has 3 sons in different fronts of the war, but really it's also kind of just a cover to the fact that she actually is concerned about her own children, and she thinks about them all the time, and she is keeping tabs on her own children.
Yeah, I think there's a lot about motherhood in here, and I think you could make the argument that she does play fair with the relationship ambiguities among Mrs. Sprott and Betty and Wanda Polonska, the woman who she shot. So let's detangle this web of intrigue here and figure out what's going on.
So Tuppence has been suggesting for some time to Tommy that they invite Albert down. He had been in their service for a very long time, but apparently like 6 years previously, he decided to open a pub.
Albert!
I know.
I love that we get the reappearance of Albert.
I know. So, he ends up kind of coming down there, and his original job was supposed to track people because he wouldn't be staying at the Sans Souci. After Tommy disappears, he's basically just wandering on around to the last places where Tommy was seen. And then in a really ludicrous few pages, he spends a lot of time musing about the recounting of people's alibis and movie plots, and then also popular songs related to movie plots, and then a popular song that he recently liked, but they can't really remember to sing it, so he goes back to some old songs that he used to sing all the time, but he really can't carry a tune. We all get this in an internal monologue from Albert, except in the cellar where Tommy has been bound and gagged by Haydock. Tommy is thinking, oh gosh, who is singing so off-key outside? And why does that sound so familiar? Then he remembers that Albert used to sing around them all the time, the same song in the exact same off-key way, and then it must be Albert outside. So keep in mind, Tommy is bound and gagged. So what he decides to do is he starts to snore in Morse code.
Which is actually kind of brilliant. And that is an example of Tommy thinking fast on his feet, which is his
or on his
skill set.
As seated, not so much on his feet in this case.
But that is Tommy's skill set, whereas Tuppence is the cerebral one. I thought that was very much in keeping with a brilliant seat of the pants solution that Tommy would make. And it's kind of goofy and silly, but hey, it's legitimate. That is one of the few sounds you can actually make when you are bound.
Right, and Albert's like, well, there aren't pigs around, so where is that sound coming from? And then he realizes that there is the SOS pattern in it.
So we realize that Tommy is going to be saved here, although we don't actually get confirmation of that for quite a while, because at the same time, Up in Cipher Decoding Central, poor Deborah Beresford is quite worried about her mother. A, Tuppence is sending her tedious, boring missives about their elderly aunt, and she is separated at the moment from Tommy. And then B, someone told Deborah that they'd seen her mother in Leahampton, not Cornwall, where she says that she is with said elderly aunt. So Deborah tells all this to her coworker, Tony Marsden, not to be confused with sociopath Anthony Marston with a T from And Then There Were None.
I know.
Who I did confuse him with for a moment.
Very confused because he's also introduced at various points as Anthony Marston. And I thought, wait, this is very strange.
Does he have crisply curling hair? Yeah, there's only one letter of difference there between those two names. But you know what? They both turn out to be pretty terrible people, so that's fine. At this point, he is presented as a sort of flirtation for Deborah, and they work together, and he is obviously interested in her, and he suggests that maybe Tuppence is stepping out on Tommy, and Deborah is horrified, and she even says, and I found this touching, that it's a family joke how much Tommy and Tuppence love each other, and that she knows that, you know, her parents would never leave each other, and that can't be the problem, and that's why she's so concerned, because it's so unlike her mother, and she's just worried. And soon after that little interchange, Deborah's room in her flat is broken into, and there is a family photograph stolen, and we are told that it is a picture of Tuppence.
Right. And then very conveniently, right after this, Tony Marsden shows up in Leahampton, and he introduces himself to Tuppence. And she kind of thinks maybe she knows who he is, because it turns out Deborah likes a lot of cute cryptographer boys and brings them on over. So, you know, she kind of thinks, well, yeah, I've probably met him before. And, of course, he knows who she is. So basically he says, you know, I'm really worried that your cover is going to be blown. Deborah doesn't know who you are, but I know who you are. I know what you did in the first war, and I know why you're down here. He also knows all about Tommy, and basically says they've tracked him down, and they have found him really safe, and he's just being held for a little while longer to keep the cover going. But what they really need is that Tuppence has to lay the trap for the mastermind who caught Tommy.
And then we have this whole sequence wherein Tony Marsden tells Tuppence that a female German spy was just intercepted via parachute trying to land in a village nearby, and that they need Tuppence to impersonate this spy and pretend that she landed successfully. So Tuppence agrees, of course, and she goes to the place where they know the spy was supposed to meet up with her contact, who is a dentist. And Tuppence's trip to the dentist goes about as well as poor Mr. Ambariotis's in 1 2 Buckle My Shoe, because the man who enters the examination room where she is waiting turns out to be none other than Commander Haydock. Dun, dun, dun. And at this point, we're not even that surprised, because we think that, yeah, sure, Haydock is the mastermind. So we knew that because we were told that when Tommy was captured by him. However, before doing her in, Haydock reveals that Tony Marsden is actually also a Nazi sympathizer who has infiltrated British intelligence. And we realize at this point that Tuppence is in real trouble here, because she has just been lured out of Sans Souci. So Tuppence then spits out the phrase goosey goosey gander as a nonsense phrase. Again, Betty with all of her nursery rhyme books. And it works exactly as the name Jane Finn worked for Tuppence at the beginning of The Secret Adversary. And it freaks out Commander Haydock, and he just goes ballistic. And she had no idea that it would do that. So yet again, another coincidence here that we've seen in other novels, and at this point we've seen several times in this novel. It seems that Tuppence just happened to hit upon the right words. Because what happens, Catherine?
He tries to keep threatening information out of her. Like, he now knows exactly what she is and who she is, and he wants to know who else knows, and essentially somehow buys her time, because at this point, Mr. Grant appears to rescue her. So they go back to Sans Souci. At this point, Tuppence now knows that there's something wrong with Goosey Goosey Gander. So she ends up pulling out the copy of it where it is really hidden in part of this game. Betty plays a game with hiding everything.
She's hidden it in Mr. Cayley's bed under his mattress.
Right. while they're all in there and Tuppence is pulling the book out, Mrs. Straught breaks in and the cover is blown because it turns out that, of course, she's actually M. And Goosey Goosey Gander is the German playbook to their fifth column effort.
They find out that there are a number of these tattered-looking nursery books, all of which contain various information that, for some reason, Mrs. Sprott, the German super spy M, had to keep about her, which I suppose fair enough. I guess she had to have the information at her fingertips, so she thought that she was hiding it in a devious place since there were newer copies of all those nursery rhymes, and Betty had even been instructed never to go into those. Like, that's why she kept on saying, like, dirty, those are dirty, those copies, but she became kind of obsessed with them in her innocent, childish way and was hiding them and whatnot. So, I mean, the business with that whole sequence at the end with the parachutist and Tony Marsden, we do find out that Tuppence outsmarted him from the get-go because she realized, I never met this man before. He did not come and visit me as a suitor of Deborah's. So the entire time that she seems to be lured out of Sans Souci without anyone backing her up, she's been making alternate plans with Mr. Grant, which is why when it's revealed that Tony Marsden is a sympathizer, that's not actually a surprise to her. And she's totally fine. And that's why Mr. Grant is able to save her in the nick of time. And of course, Tommy has been saved by Albert, and they are all fine. And they have helped the British forces live to spend another day fighting those derned Axis powers. And you know what? There's still a long road ahead by the time this book was published. But as we all know, they were eventually successful, due in no small part to Tommy and Tuppence, though they're kind of dumb children are none the wiser.
No, their children just are like, oh, yeah, our poor parents. They're so dull.
They're charmingly sheltered about it because they think that they know so much more than they do. And it shows, I suppose, what good parents Tommy and Tuppence have been, that they've managed to maintain an innocence in their children who do really love them, too. And they continue to make fun of, you know, Tommy and Tuppence are holding hands when they go to this ball. And it's a touching ending to the middle-aged Tommy and Tuppence story. And that is the end of this World War II adventure spy story.
Yes.
Before we get into our rankings, we should mention, and I really do just mean mention, because we are not going to spend a long time on the one adaptation that exists of this novel. It was released very recently in 2015 by the BBC. This is one of these newer BBC adaptations that came about from this latter-day licensing deal. And like many of those adaptations, such as And Then There Were None, we've talked about others, it is splashy and high quality from a costuming and set design and cinematography standpoint. That is all well and good, but we touched on this rendering of Tommy and Tuppence before in The Secret Adversary, because the first 3 episodes of this miniseries were The Secret Adversary, and then the 4th, 5th, and 6th episodes are NRM.
Right.
And there's so many changes that have been made. We don't have to enumerate them now because it's not worth even going into. The biggest one is that everything has been pulled up into the 1950s, and this is all Red Scare territory. So instead of it being a wartime spy story, it's a Soviet spy story. And that's not even a problem. That's fine. They have a lot of fun with the 50s setting. It's just that this series just never captured or even came close to capturing the Tommy and Tuppence relationship or dynamic at all. I had actually not seen the Secret Adversary adaptation because, Catherine, you took one for the team and watched that. I watched the older adaptation, which was our friends Francesca Annis and James Warwick.
I know.
And say what you will about those somewhat irritating and low quality.
Hey, I'd like to say that I still have some affection for those.
I have way more affection for those now that I can compare it to this recent endeavor, because they captured the spirit of Tommy and Tuppence, and David Walliams as Tommy and Jessica Raine as Tuppence just don't. And they're both fine actors. It just doesn't work. At times it seems really serious, at other times it's lighthearted. It's all over the place.
I just think it pulls all of the sort of joie de vivre out of it. And you cannot say that about the 1980s version. It always has a sparkle to it. And I think that that's the most successful thing about Tommy and Tuppence, is that there is life behind the eyes.
Yeah, I mean, the sparkle is the signature aspect of Tommy and Tuppence, which is why they're so polarizing as Christie detectives, since some people just find that irritating. And I get it. I more than get it. And I think I found it more irritating when I was a more casual reader of Christie.
Right.
I like them more having read The Secret Adversary and Partners in Crime, and now even this novel more closely, but I understand that the sparkle can grate. It's just that this adaptation didn't in any way capture it. So what's the point? What's the point of doing a Tommy and Tuppence adaptation if you're not going to capture that sparkling joie de vivre? All right, let's move on from the adaptation onto our rankings. And this is a book that is greater than the sum of its parts, not by much, but I think greater than the sum of its parts. And we are right now analyzing its parts. So we are aware of that. But just starting on plot mechanics, comparing this especially to some of the other novels Christie was writing at this time or had written recently, it's just really surprising to me that she was falling into the same pitfalls and traps that she had fallen into when she wrote her thrillers in the 1920s. This book is riddled with unrealistic coincidences. We've talked about a lot of them. The reveal of Commander Haydog as M when Tommy literally by pure accident slips in a bathroom,
right,
to me is just so bad that I don't even understand why that happened. Albert happening upon Tommy is more amusing, and the snoring thing is somewhat ingenious, but that too is hard to believe. Tuppence referencing Goosey Goosey Gander and happening,
right,
that happening to be the right thing to say. I would give this actually a 4. And then plot credibility, I think it's okay. We have humans more or less acting like humans. There are a lot of unbelievable aspects here because we're in Tommy and Tuppence thriller land. The idea of someone murmuring a cryptic phrase as they're about to die, Tommy being bashed over the head just enough to knock him out, but not too much for that brain damage that Catherine referenced earlier. Those are all rather unbelievable things. But for a Christie thriller, it's probably one of the more grounded ones. And I think that's where its setting helps it out a lot. We'll talk about setting when we get to it, but we're in a very specific time and situation here. We are in World War II. So I think it rang truer in terms of credibility for me than a lot of those other thrillers did. I'd be willing to give it a 5.
I don't want to go any higher than a 5, but I'm fine.
I don't want to go any higher either. And I think a 4 and a 5, so a 9 out of a possible 20 for plotting points overall feels right to me.
Yeah.
Like it's low, but it deserves to be really low.
Right.
Then series long characters. I think we both came out the same on this, which was a 7.
Yes.
Because Tommy and Tuppence are the best part of this Tommy and Tuppence story by far. I don't think that's a controversial statement.
No, I liked everything from like their weird ploys to get rooms closer to one another to their like covert meetings on the beach. It all works really pretty well.
It all works.
Yeah.
And it is cheesy, but I did appreciate at the end, since poor Betty Sprott did, after all, have to endure her mother being shot in the head as she was clutching her, and a 2-year-old knows what's going on. So I hope Tommy and Tuppence have actually put some of their blunt detective agency savings away for some therapy for poor Betty, because they do decide to adopt her at the end. I appreciated that. We needed some sort of closure for Betty, and I believe that Tommy and Tuppence both would have wanted to adopt her, and it would have a warm enough heart and a generous enough spirit to do so.
Yeah, I think they also need something to do, so it's probably
they need something to do.
Probably helpful.
It's true. That's true. So 7 for Tommy and Tuppence. Then standalone characters is not great. I mentioned that I think Betty Sprott is secretly the best character in the book, and that probably says more about how thinly drawn the rest of the characters are.
I mean, Mrs. O'Rourke, I think, is actually kind of scary.
Yeah, I mean, she's written as like an ogre, and she's constantly smiling at people with her terrifying teeth.
Sees
and she just
through everybody too.
Yeah. And I guess Mrs. Perenna, at least in that one sequence where she catches Tuppence in her room, is effective. It's just Mrs. Sprott is so milquetoast, and yes, Christie's doing that for the purpose of misdirection. I was impressed by how skillfully she handled the misdirection, because you really don't suspect Mrs. Sprott. until she's revealed on a first read. That's well done, but that's really not saying anything about character. That would be going more toward plot. Yeah. So a 5? What did you have?
I had a 5.
I think a 5 is being pretty kind, but why not? Let's be kind to NRM. And then setting in tone, our final category, which perhaps includes a little bit more of the ineffables when it comes to reading Christie. I think it's really good. This is one novel where people, I think it was John Curran who made this point, people often criticize Christie for never setting her novels in any place or time that's real. It's always in this general vague Christie land of country manners and tea parties, et cetera, et cetera. And that is just not true here. One of the very first sentences says, "It was the spring of 1940. We are very specifically told when this is happening. Well, and there are constant references to World War II.
Constant. And also to the geography of England, to the geography of this community that they're in, to what Sanssouci is like to being.
I was actually impressed by a lot of the wartime references, too. There's this whole sequence about Nurse Cavell, who is this British nurse who was executed by the Germans in 1915 during World War I. And they're just talking about the British opinion of Germans ever since then. And I had never heard about her. And then I did a little bit of research and I was like, why have I never heard about Edith Cavell before? That I thought was interesting. Just a lot of, you could feel that this was written during the war and by one who was steeped in war. There was also a funny reference where Tuppence apparently tends to think that Deborah's suitors all have slightly too long of hair. And Deborah tells her not to be so terribly 1916.
I know.
I can't stand short hair. I could totally imagine Rosalind and Agatha having that conversation. And they're not that far off in age from Tuppence and Deborah.
Right.
And you know what's also very interesting about this book, especially reading it in 2018, is all of the references about the problem of refugees and what to do with refugees.
Well, right, because there are several long conversations about, any of the Germans who come into England, you should put into internment camps.
This is Major Bletchley speaking. He says, "You take my word for it, this refugee business is dangerous. If I had my way, I'd intern the lot of them. Safety first. Anyone who cared could come over here and pull a long face and talk about their brothers in concentration camps. Look at that young man," he's talking about Karl von Dynam. "Arrogance in every line of him. He's a Nazi. That's what he is, a Nazi." And Christie does a really good job of laying out that viewpoint, but it's pretty clear that she doesn't share it. First of all, because Bletchley referencing safety first, we actually know that safety first was not something that Christie believed in. She hated people who were obsessed with their own safety and didn't like a little bit of danger in their lives. But also because the only true refugee we have in this story is Wanda Polonska, who is a woman who just wants her child back and ends up getting shot in the head by a British-born woman.
Well, right.
Mrs. Sprott is very specifically stated to be British-born.
Right.
On this one, I think I'd give a pretty high score, a 7.
Yeah, I thought a 7 too.
Okay, great. And then about Stuck in Its Time.
Stuck in Its Time is a little bit hard, though, because if we just gave a 7 for setting in tone, we have to be careful about Stuck in Its Time.
I know, I agree. Well, so here's the funny thing, because the negative aspect, and I'm not going to dock points for it because of the point you just made, since we are singing the praises of a novel that manages to convey its World War II-ishness, so then we can't dock points for that same thing. But I did think it was interesting how Christie makes a lot of parallels between what the British people are doing for their country and what the German people are doing for their country. I think that shows that the book was written in 1940 because I suspect it wasn't totally obvious the extent of the atrocities that were happening. Even though concentration camps are referenced, it's not like they didn't know it was happening. I don't think Christie would have made that parallel if she had written the book in 1946.
No.
But to me, that shows that the book was written in 1940.
But Christie also was involved in the First World War, which makes it seem especially odd because you would think that anybody who had been through the First World War would...
I disagree, because I think World War II, there was something very specific that happened, which was the Holocaust, right? It's a much less controversial statement to say that the Germans were doing their thing in World War I and the British were doing their thing. And horrible things happened, but the two sides were trying to win out, and eventually the Germans lost. No one would ever say that about World War II after the fact.
No, although I don't really think a lot of people were saying that about it at the time either.
But she does.
It's really kind of odd. In a weird way, there seems more disdain tossed at the Irish than at the Germans. It's always striking to me how there could be so many casual, nasty asides about the Irish in some of these.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of that. In terms of the more typical stuck in its time aspects, yes, I think the anti-Irish sentiment is interesting. And we get that in some other books, but this notion of the Irish as the enemy of the British and just being, quote, terribly perverse, I'm quoting from the book, is not great. And then at the end of the novel, we are told that Carl von Dynam is not actually Carl von Dynam. He is a British spy who has been impersonating the German Carl von Dynam, who actually committed suicide. The only reason that we're even getting this long-winded explanation is Sheila Perenna is going to end up with him and live happily ever after, which is a little problematic because it feels like she could only live happily ever after with a British man, not a German. I found to be a little problematic. But much more so is Christie's obsession with the shape of Germans' heads, Haydock being fully revealed. That bullet-headed Prussian skull. Really? Do Germans really have a different shape of
Well,
head?
it's also it's a little interesting given the history of the British family, British royal family.
Being German? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
It's a little bit interesting.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous and it feels a bit bigoted. That being said, I think there are enough mitigating factors in terms of her stance on refugees and then perhaps in a misguided, stuck in its time way, trying to give the Germans their due that I would only take off one deduction total.
For the Irish?
For everything. Well, the Irish and the German head shape.
Yeah, I guess we can take off one.
Okay. That brings us to a grand total of 4 plus 5 plus 7 plus 5 plus 7 minus 1, 27 points for NRM, putting it in a tie with Death in the Clouds and Hercule Poirot's Christmas. And I very strongly feel that it should be below both of those.
Yeah, I agree.
Putting it in 20th place out of now 30 books. As a thriller, this is one of the higher ranked thrillers. In fact, the only higher ranked thriller is The Man in the Brown Suit and The Secret Adversary, which you could argue is a thriller or perhaps more of a hybrid. So
right.
That brings us to an end of N or M, our latest foray into the ongoing adventures of Tommy and Tuppence. We will not be visiting them for quite some time, I'm sad to say. I'm actually excited for By the Pricking of My Thumbs.
Yes, I am too.
But we have many novels to go between now and then. Join us next time, not for a novel, but for a short story. That is The Case of the City Clark, or Clerk, as the case may be, a Parker Pine short story. And I am so excited to announce that our next novel coming up in a couple of weeks is, oh yes, she's back.
Dark Marple.
In the Body in the Library. We would love to hear from you, especially if you either love NRM or loathe it, if you felt strongly in either direction. You can chat with us over email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine on Twitter at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And we would love it if you took a moment to rate and review us. And we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.